a millionaire hires a woman in need to care for his sick son. One day, he came home earlier than expected and couldn't believe what he saw. The rain drummed against the tall windows of the mansion, casting shadows on the pristine marble floors. Daniel Harrison, a self-made millionaire, stood by his office desk, glancing at his phone. Another meeting. Another deal to close. But despite the success surrounding him, his mind was elsewhere, on his son, Michael. He had been diagnosed with a rare illness, one that kept him confined to his room most days, requiring round-the-clock care. Enter Emily, a woman whose past was as mysterious as her quiet demeanor. She had been hired only a few weeks ago, out of necessity rather than choice. Desperation led her to Daniel's doorstep. Her financial troubles were too great to ignore, and she accepted the job without hesitation, determined to make a difference for Michael. As the story opens, Daniel is a man at war with himself. He resents being away from his son but knows his work provides the best care money can buy. Emily, on the other hand, has her own internal battle, torn between her need for money and her growing bond with the boy. "Mr. Harrison, I assure you, Michael is in good hands," Emily spoke softly, standing at the doorway of his office as he prepared to leave for the day. Daniel's eyes flickered toward her, but his thoughts seemed distant. "It's not about trust, Emily. It's about time. Time I don't have with him." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "He's stronger than he looks, Mr. Harrison. I believe there's hope." Daniel's expression hardened. "Hope," he muttered under his breath. "We'll see about that." The tension between them lingered, unspoken emotions swirling just beneath the surface. Daniel left for his day's work, leaving Emily alone with the boy, the quiet house feeling heavier than ever. But something about Emily wasn't right. There was a lingering sense of mystery around her. She was kind, efficient, and caring, but there was a sadness in her eyes, something unspoken. And Daniel had yet to realize how deeply their lives were about to intertwine. The Harrison mansion stood as a testament to wealth, sprawling over several acres in the quiet countryside of upstate New York. Despite its grandeur, the house often felt cold, with its vast, empty rooms and silence that seemed to echo off the walls. It was a place of luxury, yet devoid of warmth, much like its owner. Emily, in contrast, came from a world far removed from such opulence. She had grown up in a small town, working odd jobs, struggling to make ends meet. Her life had been a series of closed doors until she arrived at the Harrison estate, clutching the job offer as if it were her last chance. She moved around the mansion quietly, her steps light, as though afraid to disturb the stillness. Michael's room was her sanctuary now. The boy had been her focus from the moment she stepped foot in the house. Though weak, Michael's mind was sharp, and his curiosity about the world shone through in his eyes, even when his body betrayed him. "Emily, do you think I'll ever get better?" Michael asked one afternoon, his voice barely more than a whisper as he lay in his bed. She paused, placing a hand on his forehead. "I think," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think there's always hope." Michael smiled faintly, but even that small effort seemed to tire him. Emily watched him closely, her heart heavy. It wasn't just about his illness. There was something deeper, something she sensed in the way he clung to every word she said, as if she were his only link to a world outside those walls. Meanwhile, Daniel's presence loomed over the household, even when he wasn't there. His absence was a constant reminder of the life he had chosen, a life of deals and meetings, far removed from the everyday struggles of his son. When he was home, his interactions with Michael were brief, always rushed, as if he didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. One evening, Daniel stood outside Michael's room, watching through a crack in the door as Emily read to his son. The sight of them together, Emily, patient and kind, Michael, smiling despite the pain, stirred something inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like an outsider in his own home. Emily's quiet strength was not lost on him. He had hired her out of necessity, but now he realized she brought something more than just care. She brought hope, something he had forgotten how to give. As the days passed, the tension in the mansion grew thicker. Emily's bond with Michael deepened, and Daniel began to feel his own inadequacies as a father creeping up on him. It was becoming more and more difficult to avoid the truth. His son was slipping away, and all the wealth in the world couldn't change that. One evening, Daniel returned home later than usual. The house was dark, save for the faint light coming from under Michael's door. He approached, but stopped when he heard voices inside. "I know you're scared." Emily's voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it. "But you have to trust that you're not alone in this." Michael's voice, weak but determined, followed. "I trust you, Emily. More than anyone." Daniel felt a pang of guilt. His son was confiding in Emily in ways he never had with him. He pressed his back against the wall outside the door, listening, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Inside, Emily's heart was racing. She knew that Michael was getting worse, despite the treatments. She had seen it in his eyes, the same look she had seen in someone close to her years ago. It terrified her. But she couldn't let Michael see her fear. "Promise me something," Michael said softly. "That you'll stay. That you won't leave me like everyone else." Emily hesitated, her throat tightening. She had promised herself that she wouldn't get too attached, but it was too late. Michael had gotten under her skin, in a way she hadn't expected. "I'm not going anywhere, Michael," she whispered. Daniel's hands clenched into fists as he overheard the conversation. He had provided everything for his son, doctors, specialists, the best of care, and yet, here was Emily, the one person who had broken through to Michael in ways he never could. A mixture of anger and jealousy boiled inside him. The next morning, Daniel confronted Emily as she prepared Michael's breakfast in the kitchen. "I overheard you last night," he began, his voice sharp. "You told Michael you'd stay, no matter what. But let me make one thing clear, this job, it's temporary. You can't make promises you're not sure you can keep." Emily straightened, meeting his gaze with surprising strength. "With all due respect, Mr. Harrison, Michael doesn't need someone who's only here for the paycheck. He needs someone who believes in him." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "And you think I don't believe in my own son?" "I think you're afraid," she replied softly, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Afraid of getting close to him. Afraid of losing him." For a moment, there was silence. The words hung between them like a weight. Daniel didn't know whether to be furious or grateful that someone had finally said what he had been avoiding for so long. As the days unfolded, Emily found herself more entangled in the complexities of the Harrison household than she had anticipated. Michael's condition continued to fluctuate, and the weight of her promise to him bore down on her. Yet there was more beneath the surface. Something about the way Daniel looked at her had changed since their confrontation. One afternoon, Emily sat by the window in Michael's room, reading to him as usual. Michael's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, but there was a soft smile on his face as he listened. In these moments, the world seemed to stand still. Emily cherished them, but there was a gnawing feeling in her chest, a sense that time was running out. "I used to read to him when he was little," Daniel's voice cut through the silence. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. Emily looked up, surprised. "You never told me." Daniel stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. "I didn't think it mattered. I thought, if I gave him everything he needed, that would be enough." Emily closed the book, her eyes softening. "Sometimes, it's the little things that matter most." Daniel sat down on the edge of Michael's bed, his gaze lingering on his son. "You seem to know him better than I do." "I spend more time with him," Emily replied gently. "But that doesn't mean you can't change that." The conversation hung in the air, delicate yet heavy with unspoken truths. Emily could see the pain in Daniel's eyes, the regret that had been building up over the years. He had buried himself in his work, thinking it was the right thing to do for his family, but now it was clear that something precious had been lost in the process. Meanwhile, outside the confines of the mansion, Emily's own life was unraveling. Unpaid bills, the looming threat of losing her small apartment, these were the reasons she had taken the job in the first place. But now, she was caught between her obligations to Michael and her own desperate circumstances. The longer she stayed, the more she risked losing everything she had left. And yet, how could she leave now? As the weeks passed, Daniel and Emily's relationship became more complex. What had begun as a professional arrangement now carried the weight of shared emotions and unresolved tensions. Daniel started spending more time at home, watching Emily with Michael, trying to understand the connection they had. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to open up to her, in ways he hadn't opened up to anyone in years. One evening, as they stood in the kitchen after Michael had fallen asleep, Daniel broke the silence. "You never talk about your own life," he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. Emily stiffened. "There's not much to tell." Daniel frowned. "I find that hard to believe." "You're carrying something, Emily. I can see it." She turned away, focusing on the dishes in the sink, but Daniel stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I'm not asking out of curiosity. I want to understand." Emily's hands trembled as she placed a plate in the rack. She hadn't meant to let things get this complicated. She hadn't meant to care this much. But the truth was, she was hiding more than just financial troubles. There was a part of her past she had hoped to leave behind, and now it was threatening to catch up with her. "I'm not who you think I am," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's brow furrowed, concern etched into his face. "What do you mean?" Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Not yet. The atmosphere in the mansion had shifted. Emily could feel it in every glance, every word exchanged between her and Daniel. There was something unspoken but palpable between them, a tension that had slowly built over the weeks. But with each day, it became harder to separate her growing attachment to Michael from her own life outside of this place. The pressure was mounting, and something had to give. One rainy evening, Daniel returned home earlier than expected, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil brewing inside him. He had left a board meeting abruptly, unable to focus. His mind was on Michael, on Emily, on the conversation they had shared in the kitchen. She had been hiding something, and it gnawed at him, pulling him back to the house with a sense of urgency. As he entered the mansion, the usual silence greeted him, broken only by the sound of rain tapping against the windows. He walked upstairs toward Michael's room, his footsteps slow and deliberate. But as he reached the door, he froze. The sight before him was not what he expected. Emily was sitting on the edge of Michael's bed, her hand resting gently on his forehead as she whispered something to him. But it wasn't the tenderness of the moment that struck Daniel, it was the raw emotion in Emily's voice. She was crying. Quietly, but unmistakably, her tears fell as she spoke to the boy. "I'm so sorry, Michael," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, I can't fix this. I never should have let it get this far." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. What did she mean by that? He pushed the door open a little further, careful not to make a sound, his mind racing. Could she have done something to his son? What was she hiding? Michael stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Emily, it's okay," he murmured, his voice weak. "You don't have to be sorry." Emily shook her head, wiping her eyes. "No, you don't understand. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you from the beginning." Before she could continue, Daniel stepped into the room, his face tense. "Emily, what's going on?" Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't heard him come in. For a moment, she seemed frozen in place, unsure of what to say. "Mr. Harrison," she stammered, standing up quickly. "I didn't expect you." "I came home early," Daniel interrupted, his voice cold. "I heard what you said." "What do you mean by, you let this go too far? What are you hiding?" The room felt suffocating as the weight of Daniel's words hung in the air. Emily's chest tightened. This was it, the moment she had dreaded since the day she arrived. "I never wanted to hurt him," she began, her voice shaky. "I took this job because I needed the money, but there's more to it." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. More to it? What more? What have you done? Emily took a deep breath, her hands trembling at her sides. Michael's illness, it's similar to something I've seen before. In someone I knew. Someone close to me. Daniel's face hardened. And you didn't think to tell me this sooner? I didn't know if it was the same, she replied quickly, her voice pleading. I didn't want to scare you. I thought maybe there was hope. Daniel's anger flared. Hope? You kept this from me because you thought there was hope? You had no right to make that decision for my son. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry. But I didn't want you to lose him the way I lost. Lost who? Daniel demanded, his voice rising. Emily's breath hitched, her emotions spilling over. My brother. He had the same illness, and he didn't make it. I couldn't save him. The room fell deathly silent. Daniel stared at Emily, his anger slowly giving way to something else, something he couldn't quite define. The weight of her confession, of the pain she had been carrying, hit him all at once. Emily's voice was barely a whisper now. I took this job because I thought, maybe I could do for Michael what I couldn't do for my brother. Maybe I could save him. The heavy silence was interrupted by the sudden ring of Daniel's phone. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw Dr. Carter's name. Without hesitation, he answered, exchanging a brief, tense look with Emily, who remained quietly by his side. Dr. Carter, Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady, though the nervousness was palpable. Mr. Harrison, the doctor's voice came through the line, serious but measured. I've received the latest test results for Michael, and I think we need to discuss them. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone, his breath quickening. What did you find? There was a pause on the other end, and Daniel knew instinctively that the news wouldn't be good. Michael's condition is worsening, Dr. Carter said. The treatment hasn't been as effective as we'd hoped, and we're seeing signs that his body is starting to resist the current approach. Daniel closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a physical blow. Emily, watching the tension build in his face, sensed immediately that something was very wrong. What are our options? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper, fear seeping into his tone. We can try more aggressive treatments, the doctor continued, his voice steady. But the chances of success are slim, and the side effects could make Michael more uncomfortable. I know this is hard to hear, but it's important to start thinking about what you want to do moving forward. Daniel stood frozen, the weight of the conversation bearing down on him. His mind raced, overwhelmed by the helplessness he had been trying to avoid for so long. He had always believed that the best doctors, the best care, could give Michael a fighting chance. But now, that hope seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Emily, sensing his growing despair, took a step closer, her presence a quiet offer of support. I need some time to process this, Daniel finally said, his voice shaky. Of course, Dr. Carter replied. We're here to support you and Michael, whatever decisions you make. I'm available anytime you need to talk. Thank you, Doctor, Daniel said before ending the call. He stood there for a moment, phone still in hand, staring blankly at the floor as the weight of the situation began to settle in. Emily spoke softly, her voice filled with empathy. You still have time, Daniel. Time to be there for Michael, to make sure he knows how much he means to you. Daniel didn't respond right away. The fear, the guilt, the crushing weight of losing his son, all of it was closing in on him. But deep down, he knew Emily was right. He had been running from this moment for too long, avoiding the reality of Michael's condition because he couldn't face the possibility of losing him. Finally, Daniel looked at Emily, his face a mixture of grief and newfound determination. I don't know if I can fix this, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I'm not going to run anymore. I'm going to be here, for him. Emily nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. That's all he needs. The days that followed were unlike any Daniel had experienced. He stayed home, canceling meetings and pushing work aside for the first time in years. His life, once filled with the constant hum of business deals and high-stakes decisions, had come to a halt. Now, every moment was about Michael. Daniel spent hours by his son's side, trying to make up for the lost time. He read to him, just as Emily had been doing, though his voice sometimes cracked with emotion. He held Michael's hand during the difficult moments, when his energy waned and his breathing became labored. And in those moments, Daniel found himself not only reconnecting with his son but also confronting parts of himself he had long ignored. One afternoon, while Emily prepared lunch in the kitchen, Daniel sat with Michael in the quiet room. The boy, pale but still fighting, looked up at his father with a weak smile. "Dad, you don't have to stay with me all the time," Michael said softly. "You've got important things to do." Daniel shook his head, squeezing his son's hand gently. "There's nothing more important than being here with you, Michael." Michael's eyes, tired but full of warmth, glistened with emotion. "I'm glad you're here." Daniel's heart swelled. It was such a simple statement, but coming from his son, it meant everything. He realized then how much he had missed, how much of Michael's life had slipped by while he was caught up in his own world. He had been afraid of the pain of watching his son suffer, afraid of being powerless in the face of illness. But now, being present for Michael, he understood that love wasn't about control or fixing things, it was about showing up, no matter how hard it got. Later that evening, Daniel found himself in the kitchen with Emily, helping her clean up after dinner. Their movements were quiet, almost in sync, as if they had settled into a rhythm together. "Thank you," Daniel said suddenly, breaking the silence. Emily paused, turning to look at him. "For what?" "For everything," Daniel replied, his eyes softening. "For taking care of Michael, for giving him hope when I couldn't. For being here." Emily smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I didn't do it for gratitude, Daniel. I did it because I care about him." "I know," Daniel said, leaning against the counter. "But you've done more than that. You've made me see things differently." Emily looked down, her hands fidgeting with a dish towel. "I've just tried to help where I can." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "And you've helped me, too." Emily met his gaze, surprised by his vulnerability. For the first time since she had started working there, she saw Daniel not as the distant, hardened millionaire but as a man, a father who was learning how to love his son again. A man who was slowly finding his way back to the people who mattered most. Over the next few weeks, the bond between Daniel, Michael, and Emily deepened. They formed an unlikely family of sorts, united by their shared love for the boy and their determination to make the most of the time they had. Michael, though growing weaker, seemed brighter in spirit, as if the love and attention surrounding him were giving him strength. But Emily knew that this fragile peace couldn't last forever. Michael's health was still precarious, and every day felt like a gift borrowed from an uncertain future. She had come to care for both Michael and Daniel in ways she hadn't expected, and that made the thought of what was coming even harder to bear. As the days turned into weeks, a quiet sense of urgency settled over the house. Michael's condition, though stable for now, remained fragile, and both Daniel and Emily knew that time was not on their side. Yet, in those fleeting moments, there was also a sense of peace, a strange, bittersweet calm as they all made the most of every day together. One evening, while the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm golden glow through the windows, Daniel sat with Emily on the patio. The house was quiet, Michael having fallen asleep early after a long day of visitors from the family. The air between them was filled with the unspoken, as it often was now, a shared understanding of the weight they both carried. "I've been thinking a lot," Daniel said, breaking the silence, his voice low. "About what happens next?" Emily turned to look at him, her expression cautious. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been preparing for the worst for so long," Daniel said, his gaze distant. "But I'm starting to wonder if maybe there's still a way to help him, to give him a future." Emily's heart tightened. She had seen this before, the desperate hope of a parent who wasn't ready to let go. She knew how dangerous that hope could be, how much it could blind someone to the reality in front of them. But she couldn't bring herself to crush that small glimmer of hope in Daniel's eyes. "What are you thinking?" she asked carefully. "I've been looking into experimental treatments," Daniel admitted. "There's a doctor in California who's been working on a new therapy for conditions like Michael's. It's risky, and it's not guaranteed, but it's something." Emily's breath caught. The rational part of her wanted to argue against it, to tell Daniel that they had to accept what was happening. But how could she? She had promised Michael she would never give up on him, and now, seeing Daniel so determined to fight for his son, she didn't have the heart to oppose him. "Do you think it could work?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "I don't know. But it feels like the only option left." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Daniel's phone vibrating on the table. He picked it up, glancing at the screen, his brow furrowing. "It's Dr. Carter," he said, answering the call. Emily watched as Daniel's face shifted, his expression tightening with each word the doctor said. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she knew something was wrong. After a long silence, Daniel finally spoke into the phone. "Thanks, doctor. I'll talk to him." He hung up, his face pale. "What did he say?" Emily asked, her heart pounding. Daniel stared at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. "The latest tests show Michael's condition is deteriorating faster than we thought. Dr. Carter doesn't think he has much time left." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. She had been bracing for this moment, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of it. She looked at Daniel, who seemed to be in shock, the weight of the news crushing him. "He doesn't think there's anything else we can do?" she asked softly. Daniel shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. He said, "We should prepare for the end." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emily felt a deep ache in her chest, knowing what this meant for Michael, for both of them. She had grown to love him like a son, and now, the thought of losing him was unbearable. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing back and forth, his hands running through his hair. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I can't accept that. I won't. There has to be something, anything, we can do." Emily stood as well, placing a hand on his arm to stop him. "Daniel, I know this is hard, but—" "No!" Daniel snapped, his eyes wild with grief. "I won't just sit here and wait for him to die." Emily flinched at the intensity of his words, but she didn't pull away. She understood his pain, his desperation, but she also knew that he needed to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears welling up in her eyes. "You need to be with him. He needs you now more than ever." Daniel's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, the fight seemed to drain out of him. He looked at Emily, his eyes filled with anguish. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to say goodbye." Emily's heart broke for him, but she held her ground, knowing that he needed to hear the truth. "You don't have to say goodbye yet," she said gently. "But you need to be there for him, for whatever time is left." Daniel nodded slowly, tears brimming in his eyes. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving Emily standing on the patio, her own heart heavy with sorrow. The air in the mansion was thick with an unspoken tension. Every moment felt like a countdown, each ticking second a reminder of how little time was left. Daniel had taken Emily's words to heart. He spent every waking hour by Michael's side, reading to him, talking to him, just being there. But the shadow of impending loss loomed over him, and no matter how hard he tried, Daniel couldn't shake the growing fear that each moment with his son might be the last. One evening, after a particularly difficult day where Michael had struggled to stay awake for more than a few minutes at a time, Daniel sat alone in the dimly lit living room. The quiet hum of the house only amplified the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. He had made a decision, one that he wasn't sure anyone, especially Emily, would agree with. As if on cue, Emily walked into the room, her expression somber yet calm. She had sensed that something was on Daniel's mind all day. "Daniel?" she asked, her voice soft. "Are you all right?" He glanced at her, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "I've made arrangements," he said quietly. Emily's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I contacted the doctor in California," Daniel explained, his voice steady but laced with tension. "The one I told you about. He's willing to try the experimental treatment on Michael." Emily's heart sank. She had feared this. "Daniel, we talked about this. You know how risky that is." "I don't care about the risks," Daniel snapped, standing up and pacing the room. "I'm not ready to give up on him. I can't just sit here and watch him die when there's something, anything, we can do." Emily took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I understand how you feel. I don't want to lose him either. But this treatment, it could make things worse. It could take away the little time he has left." Daniel's face twisted with anguish, his voice rising. "And what if it works? What if it gives him a chance? You don't know that it won't." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she didn't back down. "And you don't know that it will. I promised Michael I wouldn't let him suffer more than he already has. This treatment, it could be too much for him." Daniel's hands shook as he ran them through his hair, his frustration and desperation boiling over. "So what do you want me to do, Emily? Just accept that he's going to die? Just sit here and watch it happen?" Emily's voice cracked as she spoke. "No, I want you to be with him. I want you to hold his hand, talk to him, let him know that you're there. Because that's what he needs right now, Daniel, not another doctor, not another procedure. He needs you." The room fell into a heavy silence. Daniel's chest heaved as he fought back tears, his anger fading into something deeper, an unbearable grief. He had spent so long trying to control the situation, trying to fix things, that he hadn't realized what his son truly needed from him. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of a weak voice from the hallway. "Dad?" Both Daniel and Emily turned to see Michael standing there, his small frame frail, but his eyes wide and alert. He had heard everything. "Michael," Daniel whispered, his voice filled with emotion. Michael took a shaky breath, looking between his father and Emily. "I don't want any more treatments," he said softly, but firmly. "I just want to stay here, with you." The weight of his words crashed over Daniel, and for the first time, he truly understood. Michael was tired. He didn't want to fight anymore. He just wanted peace. Daniel crossed the room in a few strides, kneeling in front of his son, his hands gently holding Michael's. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice breaking. Michael nodded, tears in his eyes. "I just want to be home." Emily's heart ached as she watched the two of them, the bond between father and son finally strong and clear. She stepped back, giving them space, knowing that this moment wasn't hers to share. Daniel wrapped his arms around Michael, holding him close. "Okay," he whispered through his tears. "Okay, buddy. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed were filled with an eerie kind of calm. The decision had been made, and with it came a sense of peace, even though it was laced with sorrow. Michael spent his final days at home, surrounded by the people he loved most. There were no more hospital visits, no more aggressive treatments, just quiet moments filled with stories, laughter, and the warmth of being together. Daniel stayed by his son's side, rarely leaving the room except when absolutely necessary. The urgency he once felt to fix everything had melted away, replaced by a deep, unwavering commitment to making each remaining moment count. He read Michael's favorite books, shared stories from his own childhood, and even brought Michael outside on the porch to feel the sun on his face on the rare days he had the strength. Emily, ever present, provided comfort in her own quiet way. She had become more than just Michael's caregiver, she was now a part of their family. And while her heart ached for what was coming, she knew they were giving Michael the gift of peace. She watched as Daniel transformed from a man obsessed with control to a father who had learned to be fully present in the most difficult moments of life. One night, after Michael had fallen asleep, Daniel sat with Emily in the living room. The house was silent, save for the sound of the fire crackling softly in the hearth. "I never thought I could do this," Daniel said quietly, staring into the flames. "I never thought I could let go." Emily, sitting beside him, nodded. "You're not letting go," she said gently. "You're giving him the chance to leave on his own terms." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to fully feel the weight of his grief. "I just wanted to give him everything. But I see now, he didn't need everything. He just needed me." Emily placed a comforting hand on his arm, her own eyes misty. "And you've given him that. More than anything else, you've given him love." Daniel nodded, his heart full of both pain and gratitude. He had made mistakes, he had spent so much of Michael's life focused on the wrong things, but in the end, he had found his way back to what truly mattered. A few days later, in the early hours of the morning, Michael passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Daniel holding his hand. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the bittersweet sorrow of loss. But there was also a sense of relief, a quiet understanding that Michael was no longer suffering, and that his final days had been filled with love and comfort. As the sun rose, casting soft light over the mansion, Daniel stood by the window, watching the new day begin. Emily stood beside him, her presence a quiet support. "He's at peace now," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Daniel nodded, tears streaming down his face. "He is," he whispered. "And for that, I'm grateful." They stood together in silence, the weight of loss heavy but shared. In the stillness, Daniel knew that life would never be the same, but he also knew that Michael's memory would live on in the love they had shared. Months had passed since Michael's death, and the house that once felt empty and cold had become a place of quiet reflection and healing. Daniel had taken time away from work, focusing instead on rebuilding his life, one step at a time. The grief still lingered, but it had softened, becoming a part of him rather than a weight he couldn't bear. Emily had stayed for a while after Michael's passing, helping Daniel adjust to his new reality. They had grown close over the months, bonded by their shared love for Michael and the journey they had taken together. But eventually, it was time for her to move on. As she stood by the front door, her bags packed and ready, Daniel faced her, his expression somber but full of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice quiet. "You saved both of us in ways I never could have imagined." Emily smiled softly, her eyes filled with emotion. "You don't need to thank me. You gave Michael what he needed most in the end, that's all that matters." Daniel nodded, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. "I'll never forget you, Emily." "And I'll never forget either of you," she replied. They stood there for a moment, neither wanting to say goodbye but knowing it was time. Finally, Daniel pulled Emily into a hug, holding her tightly for a few moments before stepping back. "Take care of yourself," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You too," he replied, watching as she walked down the steps and out of his life, leaving behind only the memory of what they had shared. As the door closed behind her, Daniel stood in the quiet house, the memories of Michael still fresh in his mind. But this time, there was no rush, no overwhelming sadness, just the peace of knowing that he had been there for his son when it mattered most. He looked out the window, the sun setting behind the hills, and smiled to himself. Life would go on. It wouldn't be the same, but it would go on. And Michael's memory would stay with him, a quiet, enduring light that would guide him through whatever came next. As you close this chapter, take a moment to reflect on the power of love, loss, and the resilience of the human spirit. If this story touched you, consider sharing it with others who may need a reminder that, even in the darkest times, there is light in connection and compassion. Feel free to share your thoughts and reflections in the comments. What part of this story moved you the most? How did Daniel and Michael's journey resonate with you? Thank you for being part of this emotional journey. Let's keep the conversation going, your perspective matters.